The sun was low over the Oklahoma camp, turning the dirt red as fire. Anna, 24, German, pale from hunger, wrists raw from travel, stepped off the military truck with dread pounding in her ears. She had not seen a black man up close before, not one like this. Tall, stoic, his hat low over his brow, boots worn from saddle work. He looked like something from a storybook she'd never been allowed to read. He stepped forward slowly. No barked orders, no rifle raised, just a gloved hand extending toward her. In it, an apple, bright, red, clean. The first piece of fresh fruit she'd seen since 1942. Anna blinked. Her hands trembled. She took it, murmured, "Danke," and tried to hold herself together, but something cracked. She burst into tears, not from fear, not from pain, but from kindness. A single apple, offered by a man she was taught to fear. Undone years of war inside her. And it was only the beginning. The silence began in Leipzig. Not the silence of peace, but of absence, of neighbors who had fled or died, of sirens that no longer sounded because there were no more warnings left to give. Anna stood in the skeleton of her childhood apartment, a fifth-floor walk-up where the windows had blown out weeks before, and stared at the smoke curling from the railway yard. Somewhere in the fog, her city was being carved apart. The Americans had not yet entered, but their planes had spoken first, booming declarations from the sky that left streets flattened and bakeries gone. She remembered the taste of soot in her teeth, and the eerie stillness that followed every air raid. No voices, no crying, just the soft hiss of things burning. By then, her mother was already gone. Her brother, last seen on a train headed east, hadn't written in over a year. All she had left was her uniform, her service badge as a clerk in the Luftwaffe offices, and a suitcase with broken clasps. The surrender came like a rumor at first, then like a wave. There were no battles in her street, no gunfire, just a pale officer standing in a truck bed, reading out orders in a voice that barely rose above the wind. Lay down your weapons, await further instructions, stay where you are. For Anna and the other auxiliaries, mostly women like her, secretaries, typists, signalers, the moment hit like a slap. They had trained with drills, lectures, patriotic films, the pounding insistence that capture was worse than death. They had recited vows to fight to the last, to burn code books before falling into enemy hands. Yet now they stood in a churchyard, hands raised, watching the enemy arrive without resistance. There was no fight, just shame. It hung heavier than her pack. The Americans didn't shout, they didn't jeer. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. They were organized, quiet, almost bored. Their uniforms were clean, their boots shined, and they moved like men who already knew they had won. One of them glanced at her for a moment, then turned away without a word. That absence of cruelty disarmed her more than a shove ever could have. She waited for insults, for humiliation, for some confirmation that her fears had not been misplaced. But they never came. Instead, she was ordered, gently even, to gather her things. She was told she would be transferred. No idea where, no idea why. She nodded, mute, and boarded the truck with the others. It was there, on the wooden benches of the transport vehicle, that she noticed her own hunger fully for the first time, the kind that scraped from within, the kind that blurred thoughts. They hadn't eaten properly in days. The officers had fled. The rations were gone. She watched the soldiers pass around canteens and sandwiches to each other, and her stomach twisted at the smell of bread. But none was offered to the prisoners. Not yet. Not until later. The quiet deepened on the road. Towns passed like ghosts, a village with no smoke, a station where the clocks had stopped. They traveled for hours, then days, always westward, deeper into the unknown. Sleep came in snatches. The guards never shouted. Even when they gave orders, it was with a strange professionalism, like hotel clerks managing guests instead of enemies. Anna found herself listening for cruelty and hearing only boots in gravel. And so she waited for the punishment she had been promised, waited for the cruelty she had been taught to expect. Every moment without it was its own form of tension. It wasn't mercy, it was confusion. What kind of war ended like this? Not with fire, but with forms, not with blood, but with paperwork. When the truck finally stopped at the edge of a barbed wire camp, and she saw a black cowboy walking toward her with an apple in his hand, Anna felt her chest seize again. Not from fear, not yet, but from the dawning sense that the world she had known was over. What came next would not be brutality, but something stranger, more difficult to face. Kindness. And the war inside her was only just beginning. It began with darkness, the kind that swallowed sound and stretched time into something unrecognizable. Anna had no idea how long they had been inside the cattle car. Hours, days. The air was thick with sweat and rot, and the wooden slats barely let in enough light to mark the passing of morning to night. They were packed in shoulder to shoulder, pressed between breathing bodies, silence broken only by the occasional cough or the desperate rasp of someone praying. Lice moved easily from collar to collar, blouses stuck to skin. The stench of urine soaked the floorboards. Someone fainted. Someone else whispered they'd gone mad. No one had room to sit without leaning into someone else's bones. There was no map, no explanation. Just the jolt and lurch of the train beneath them, groaning westward across a continent none of them had ever seen. The wheels screeched like some mechanical animal, dragging them toward a fate that none could name. At first, they speculated. One woman said they were being sent to dig ditches in coal mines. Another whispered of experimental camps in the desert. But those voices faded after the second night. Or what they assumed was night. The body could no longer tell. Hunger crept in like a second skin. Lips cracked, throats ached. One girl tried to scratch at her arm where something bit her, but had no room to lift her hand. Anna didn't speak. She counted the heartbeats in her head just to hold something steady. When the voices did rise, they weren't about food or water. They were about the guards, specifically him, the cowboy, the black soldier. His image lingered more vividly than any meal. What was he? What were they? One woman muttered that she had heard stories of African soldiers in French ranks, how they were beasts in uniform, savages hidden behind discipline. Another insisted the Americans let them roam the streets with knives. The propaganda had been clear. These men were the worst of the enemy, less than human, dangerous. Anna wanted to say something, wanted to speak of the apple, of the way he hadn't looked at her like prey, but her throat was too dry and her thoughts too tangled with guilt. How could she explain the confusion of that moment? That she had felt safer in his gaze than she ever had with a German officer? The train slowed once, then again, but never stopped, a rhythm of false hope. Then, finally, with a metallic gasp, it halted for good. The door slid open with a grinding shriek, and light punched into the boxcar. They flinched. Blinked, coughed. Anna felt her knees buckle as she stepped down. Her legs had forgotten how to hold her. The ground was dirt, rust-red and dry, stretching flat to the horizon. No mountains, no ruins, just heat and the smell of dust. Oklahoma. They didn't know the name yet, but the sun overhead felt like it had teeth. The fences looked temporary, almost too thin to hold anything. But the guards were there, rifles at their shoulders, and in the distance, a man on horseback. He wore the same wide-brimmed hat, same posture, the same slow gait as he rode the fence line. It was him, the black cowboy. He didn't look at them, not at first. He just rode, calm as water, as if the arrival of German prisoners was nothing worth noticing. The absurdity hit Anna like a wave. She was supposed to be a threat. She had worn the eagle and the swastika. She had carried documents marked confidential, and here she was, just another woman in a line of the defeated, being watched over by a man whose existence her country had called a lie. Above her, the sky stretched so wide it made her dizzy. There were no cities to crush her, no walls to hem her in, just wind and barbed wire, and a sun that refused to hide. It didn't feel like captivity, it felt like exposure. The camp rose ahead, orderly, strange, and waiting. And with every step, Anna realized she was no longer afraid of what the Americans might do to her. She was afraid of what she might feel. The next morning, Anna saw him again. The sun was still dragging itself up from the horizon, and the camp was coated in a thin sheen of dew. She had barely slept. Her thoughts had clung to the rickety walls of the barracks, echoing through her chest like stray wind. But when she stepped outside, breath fogging in the dawn, there he was, the black cowboy. He was walking the perimeter like he had all the time in the world, as if he weren't watching over prisoners but tending to cattle. His shoulders didn't move the way soldiers did, no jerks, no stiffness. He walked like the earth belonged to him, like he knew it, trusted it. And that morning he had something in his hand, another apple. He wasn't looking at her, not yet, but he was coming closer, and something in Anna's chest began to twist again. The guards were watching. So were the women behind her. She felt the weight of their eyes before he reached her, curious, jealous, maybe even afraid. He paused only briefly, met her gaze, and without a word, held the apple out again. Her fingers moved before she could stop them, brushing his glove as she took it. And again, like the first time, she whispered, "Danke." He nodded, slow, and kept walking. This time, she didn't cry. Not until later. Not until she was back inside, alone, staring at the fruit in her hand. It was cool, red, impossibly clean. A ridiculous thing, really. A farm apple from a country she was supposed to hate. But what unmade her wasn't the apple. It was what it meant. In her world, kindness was rationed like soap. It was transactional, expected only from allies or family, and only when convenient. Kindness from an enemy, from someone she'd been told was beneath her, was not just confusing. It was unbearable. The other women said little, but she felt the shift. One muttered that he was trying to humiliate her. Another accused her of being naive. A third said nothing, only looked away. Anna didn't respond. She didn't know how to explain the feeling. The way her stomach had knotted, not in fear, but in recognition, as if some part of her, buried deep beneath propaganda and pride, had known the difference between cruelty and care all along. And now that it had surfaced, she couldn't push it down again. The cowboy passed again in the afternoon. Same pace, same hat. The sun caught his belt-buckle and made it gleam. A child back home might have thought him a character from a pulp magazine, but to Anna he was something more destabilizing. Proof. Proof that not everything she had been told about America, about its people, about race, was true. In Germany, blackness had been painted as danger, as degeneracy. Every newsreel, every leaflet, every whisper in the back rooms of the Reich's offices had confirmed it. And now, here he was, gentle, silent, offering fruit instead of fury. She began to notice how other guards avoided him, not openly, but subtly. They nodded without warmth. They didn't sit near him in the mess hall. One even scowled when the cowboy walked by, like his very presence was inconvenient. It was a different kind of war, she realized, one the Americans didn't talk about. She wondered what it cost him to be here, in uniform, guarding enemies who had been taught to despise him. And yet he had handed her an apple. Twice. In the quiet hours before lights out, Anna held the fruit again. She didn't eat it, not yet. She wanted to remember what it felt like to be offered something without conditions. Not a trick, not a transaction, just a gift. The war had taken many things from her, family, certainty, even hunger. But it had never prepared her for this, that the person she feared most might be the one to treat her like a person. And in that fragile, dangerous recognition, something deeper than fear began to take root. The scent came first. It curled through the air just after sunrise, winding through the wooden slats of the barracks and prying open eyes not yet ready for another day. Anna sat up slowly, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, and inhaled. Bacon. Real bacon. The smell was almost violent in its richness. Grease, smoke, salt, everything they hadn't had for years. It made her stomach tighten and twist, not just with hunger, but confusion. Was this meant for them? Voices stirred outside, footsteps. A bell rang, not harshly, but as if to announce a meal, not a command. The women stepped into the open light with hesitant eyes, falling into a line that formed instinctively. Anna stood among them, still holding the uneaten apple from the day before. It felt absurd now, a talisman from a different world, still unbitten, still sacred. The mess hall was ahead, wooden, sun-drenched, and entirely unremarkable, except for what waited inside. The sound struck her next. Laughter, low, casual, unmistakable. She had not heard laughter in months. Not real laughter, not unguarded. It came from inside the canteen, followed by the clatter of metal trays and the scrape of chairs. The line moved. The door opened wider. Anna's eyes adjusted, and what she saw made her freeze. American soldiers, sitting at tables, eating, the same food, eggs, toast, bowls of thick, glistening stew, bacon piled like memory made real. Some of the soldiers leaned back in their chairs, sipping coffee, talking casually. One flipped through a folded newspaper, another poured syrup over his pancakes like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. It didn't look like a prison camp. It looked like a college cafeteria. The absurdity of it struck like a blow. When it was Anna's turn, a soldier behind the counter handed her a tray with the same practiced rhythm he used for the man ahead of her. He didn't meet her eyes, but he didn't look away in disgust either. On the tray, scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, a ladle of stew, a strip of bacon. Real bacon. Her hand trembled as she accepted it. She carried it to the nearest empty seat and sat slowly, trying not to look at anyone, trying not to feel the gaze of the others who might be wondering, like she was, if this was a mistake. The first bite undid her. It was the stew that broke through, beef, carrots, salt, and oil so thick it clung to her lips. She chewed once, then again, then stopped. Her eyes stung. Her hands shook. She wasn't supposed to eat like this. She wasn't supposed to be treated like this. The bacon sat there, taunting her with its ordinary perfection. Her body wanted it. Her pride resisted. It felt wrong to enjoy what her mother had begged for in their final winter. It felt like betrayal to let it taste good. Across the room, she caught a glimpse of the cowboy. He sat at the edge of a table with 2 other guards, eating the same eggs she had. His plate was nearly empty. He didn't speak. He chewed slow, then stood and carried his tray to a bin without fanfare. No performance, no cruelty, just a man eating breakfast. Anna turned back to her food. The toast had cooled. The bacon was still warm. She picked it up with shaking fingers, brought it to her mouth, and bit. The fat melted on her tongue, salty and rich and too much. It reminded her of Sundays long gone, before the uniforms and the rubble, before the silence and the lies. A meal should not make someone cry, and yet when she looked down at her tray again, her eyes were full. The shame came later, quiet, slow, and suffocating. She had eaten every bite, she had savored it, she had wanted more, and when she looked at the other women across the room, she saw the same battle etched in their faces. Hunger, guilt, confusion. Some ate like ghosts, others left food untouched. A few tried to smile, only to cover their mouths with napkins, embarrassed by the sound of joy. No one spoke of it afterward, not directly, but the air was different, heavier. Because kindness, it turned out, was harder to swallow than cruelty. It stayed in the throat longer. It echoed when the stomach was full. And Anna, walking back to the barracks with the apple still in her pocket and the taste of bacon on her lips, realized that this war would not be fought with bullets anymore. It would be fought with breakfast. Days passed, and the rhythm of camp life began to take shape. Roll call, meals, work, the soft hum of American order settling into every crevice of their captivity. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't punishment either. It was something in between, something that made the women restless because it didn't fit the shape of what war had taught them to expect. Then, one morning, a notice appeared on the mess hall wall, printed in 2 languages. English lessons for prisoners of war, attendance optional. Beneath it, a schedule, a time, and a small drawing of a chalkboard. Optional. The word itself felt strange, almost luxurious. Anna stared at it for a long time before stepping away, pretending not to care. But that afternoon, curiosity pulled her toward the long wooden hut near the edge of the camp where the lessons were held. The windows were open, the smell of chalk dust mixing with the faint scent of soap and coffee. Inside, rows of benches faced a blackboard. A sergeant stood at the front, sleeves rolled to his elbows, holding a piece of chalk that clicked softly against the board as he wrote a word in block letters. Freedom. The syllables looked foreign, their shape awkward and unfamiliar. Beneath it, smaller words appeared. Name. Thank you. Home. Anna's breath caught. The words themselves were simple, but the weight behind them pressed against her chest. Freedom. She didn't know what that meant anymore. The sergeant smiled and motioned for them to repeat after him. Free-dom. The sound rippled unevenly across the room, broken by accents, hesitation, pride. Anna's tongue stumbled over the R. The sergeant corrected them patiently, again and again, until the word rolled smoother, lighter. It was absurd, prisoners practicing freedom, but something about it made her throat tighten. When the next word came, name, she whispered hers quietly. Anna. The man nodded, wrote it on the board beside hers, and repeated it. Ah, na. She didn't expect to feel her name come alive in another person's mouth. It startled her how intimate it sounded in English. Then the cowboy walked in. He didn't wear a rifle today, only his uniform and that same weathered hat. He carried a stack of notebooks under one arm, and when the sergeant handed him a stick of chalk, he smiled faintly, as if this small duty amused him. The women went rigid. Some averted their eyes. Anna tried to keep hers fixed on the board, but his voice, low, warm, slow, filled the room. "We'll start with greetings," he said, his accent smooth and soft-edged. "Hello," How are you?" He repeated the words until they began to echo them back, hesitant, stumbling, and then laughing quietly at the sound of themselves. When he mispronounced a German word in return, Guten Morgen twisted into something like Goat en Morgen, the room broke into real laughter for the first time since their capture. The cowboy laughed too, shaking his head. The moment passed like a crack of sunlight through fog. Anna found herself smiling before she could stop it, and when his eyes met hers across the benches, it was only for a second, but long enough to send her heart racing. After class, the women whispered furiously. Why was he here? Why him? Was this another test, another trick to make them lower their guard? Yet, even as they spoke, none could deny the ease that had settled in the room when he'd laughed. The barrier between captor and captive had thinned, if only for a breath. Over the next weeks, the words accumulated. Bread, sky, heart. Simple things that meant more than they should. The cowboy sometimes helped them practice pronunciation outside, correcting with a grin when they mixed their vowels. His patience unnerved Anna. It made her question the script she had been handed since girlhood. The Reich had promised hierarchy, certainty, the comfort of knowing one's place. But here, a man her culture had called lesser was teaching her to speak, to think in another language. And that, she realized, was the most dangerous gift of all. For in learning the enemy's words, she was also learning to hear his humanity. And once a word like thank you is spoken sincerely, there is no way to unhear it. The chance to work outside came a week later. The notice was brief, posted on the same board that had once offered language lessons. Volunteers needed for field maintenance. The guards said little more than that. Most of the women assumed it meant hard labor, punishment disguised as duty. But Anna's curiosity, by now a steady ache in her chest, pushed her forward. Her name was added to the list before she could talk herself out of it. The next morning, the gates opened, and for the first time she stepped beyond them, not as a captive, but as a worker. The air smelled different there, wild and open. The wind carried dust and the faint sweetness of dry grass. And then she saw him, the cowboy again, standing near a shed, holding a burlap sack filled with seeds. He didn't speak at first, just handed her a small paper packet, light enough to feel like nothing. Inside, tiny brown specks rattled softly. "You'll plant here," he said finally, gesturing toward a patch of red earth. His voice was the same, low, unhurried, deliberate. She looked down at the soil. It was dry, stubborn, the color of rusted iron, a graveyard for roots. "Nothing grows here," she muttered under her breath, in German. He seemed to understand anyway. "Everything grows if you give it a chance," he replied, with a half-smile that faded as quickly as it appeared. She crouched down and began to dig. The sun pressed on her neck like a hand. Sweat gathered in the hollow of her back. The first handful of dirt was hot, gritty, alive with tiny pebbles. She worked slowly, methodically, following the cowboy's gestures from a distance. How deep to place the seeds, how far apart to space them. Her fingers ached, her palms stung, but something about the repetition calmed her. Dig, drop, cover, repeat. Each movement felt like a heartbeat returning after too long a silence. Around her, other women worked too, some muttering complaints, others humming quietly to themselves. The sound was almost peaceful. When the watering cans were brought out, the cowboy motioned for her to follow. They walked together to the pump by the shed. He worked the handle with practiced strength, and cold water burst from the spout, splashing her wrist. She gasped. It had been so long since she'd felt anything that pure. Without a word, he handed her the can and nodded toward the rose. She carried it back carefully, tipping the metal spout just enough to dampen the earth. Droplets darkened the soil like ink, and for a moment she imagined each one a promise, growth, renewal, maybe even forgiveness. When she turned back, he was watching, not with pity, not with pride, just with quiet recognition, a look that said he understood what it meant to find meaning in small things. She looked away, embarrassed by the warmth rising in her chest. The others didn't notice. They were too busy complaining about the heat or the dirt or the way their knees hurt from kneeling too long. But Anna didn't mind. The work gave her something the barracks never could: purpose without punishment. By the end of the day, her hands were raw, her arms sore, but her heart felt lighter. That night, she dreamed of the seeds. She saw them pushing through the red soil, green shoots trembling under the sun. She dreamed of the cowboy, too, his voice somewhere behind her, telling her to keep watering, to wait. When she woke, her palms still smelled faintly of dirt and metal, the scent clinging like truth. In the days that followed, she returned to the patch of earth again and again. Sometimes he joined her, fixing tools or checking the rows, speaking little. They didn't need words anymore. Their silence had found its own rhythm, steady, human, and strangely kind. And as the first fragile sprouts broke through the red crust, Anna felt something inside her shift. It wasn't victory, it wasn't surrender. It was simply life, insisting on returning, even here, behind fences and under watchful eyes. The seeds had done what she hadn't believed possible. They had made her believe again. Belief, however, is a fragile thing. It doesn't take root all at once. It grows slowly, watered not by certainty, but by questions. And the biggest question in the camp wasn't about the war, or the food, or even the future. It was him. The cowboy. The man who moved through the camp like he didn't belong to it. Who watched over them without menace. Who spoke sparingly, worked quietly, and offered apples without demand. Rumors wrapped around him like wind through barbed wire. Some of the women whispered he had been a Tuskegee airman, one of the elite black pilots they'd only heard of in passing. Ghosts in the sky who defied every narrative they'd been told. Others thought he might have been part of the famed Buffalo Soldiers, veterans of battles long before this war, trained on horseback and rifle. A few claimed he wasn't American at all, that he was from somewhere further south or west, or somewhere too far from the Reich's reach to be understood. Anna listened to the rumors, but she didn't speak. She just watched him, each day, as he tended the garden's edge or handed out tools, his hat tilted low, his silence more powerful than any story they could conjure. But one afternoon, after a long shift in the field, she didn't watch from afar. She asked. The sun was dipping behind the mess hall, casting long shadows across the tilled rows. Anna sat on a crate, dust clinging to her arms, her legs aching from work. He walked past, carrying a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his steps steady as always. Something in her, maybe exhaustion, maybe need, made her speak. "Were you always a soldier?" she asked in halting English. Her voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the wind. He stopped, looked at her. Not surprised, not bothered, just quiet. "No," he said, "I was a cowboy." The words hung there, plain and unmysterious. Anna blinked. She had expected a legend, a title with medals. Not this. "A real one?" she asked, uncertain. He nodded. "Texas, ranch work, long before the war." That was all he said, but in those few syllables, something clicked. It explained the way he moved, the looseness of his walk, the way he didn't seem to guard them as much as watch them. like they were half-wild creatures learning how to breathe again. A cowboy, before uniform, before barbed wire, before war. The revelation stunned her in its simplicity. She almost asked more about his life, his family, his reasons, but he had already turned, walking away with the same slow stride, the rope brushing his leg. She sat in silence for a long while after, the word echoing in her mind. Cowboy. It sounded like fiction, but he was real, and that made all the difference. The next morning she looked at him differently. Not as a symbol, not as a contradiction, but as something more complicated. A man built by earth and labor, who had traded dust for duty, and who carried dignity like a second skin. She watched how the other guards interacted with him. Some ignored him entirely, some nodded without warmth. His skin marked him as different, even here. But he didn't seem to shrink from it. If anything, he wore that difference with a quiet defiance. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't bark orders. But when he entered a room, something shifted. Not fear, not authority. Respect, maybe, or something close to it. Anna had never known that kind of power, the kind that didn't demand obedience, but invited reflection. It unsettled her. It inspired her. She had grown up in a world that taught her superiority came from uniform, title, blood, and yet here was a man who needed none of those things to command attention, and that, she thought, was the story beneath the hat. Not medals, not myths, but strength without spectacle, dignity born from dust, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to be anything less than human. When the announcement came that prisoners would be allowed to write letters home, the barracks filled with a sound Anna hadn't heard since before the war: hope. It was faint, hesitant, but unmistakable. The women sat upright on their bunks, clutching the thin sheets of paper handed out by the guards, staring at them as though they were relics. Ink and paper had become luxuries in Germany's final years. Now they were being given freely, along with envelopes and stamps marked U.S. Army Postal Service. For a moment, Anna felt a flicker of something like gratitude, but it was chased quickly by dread. What could she possibly write? How could she describe the world she now lived in? The food, the laughter, the kindness. How could she tell the truth without sounding like a liar? That night, she sat on her cot with the paper before her pencil dull, her hands trembling. Around her, others whispered drafts aloud. "I am safe," one woman murmured. "I am treated well." Another added, "We work hard, but we are fine." Anna pressed her pencil to the page and stopped. The words she wanted to write were dangerous ones. "They feed us," she thought. "They treat us with dignity. A man I was taught to despise gave me fruit sweeter than anything I have ever tasted." But that was not the story her mother would understand. It wasn't the story anyone back home could. How could she write that the enemy had shown more humanity than her own country had managed in years? She stared at the paper until her vision blurred. The paradox of confession sat heavy in her chest. To write honestly would be to betray everything she had once believed. To lie would be to betray herself. Every sentence she formed turned brittle, false. The Americans are kind. No, that sounded wrong, too simple. The camp is clean. True, but meaningless. We are alive. That, at least, was safe. The rest she swallowed, letting the truth rot in her throat. Around her, pencils scratched. Hope fluttered. And then the lights went out, leaving her in darkness with a blank page. The next morning, she found the pencil missing. In its place, at the edge of her bunk, lay another, sharpened to a fine, careful point. The wood was smooth, freshly cut. She knew instantly who had left it. The cowboy's handiwork was quiet but unmistakable. He had noticed somehow, without a word. The gesture undid her. It wasn't just kindness, it was understanding, an unspoken permission to keep trying. She took the pencil and held it tightly, her thumb tracing the fine shavings near the tip. When she began again, the words came differently. This time, she didn't write to her mother. She wrote to no one, to everyone. The letter became something else entirely, not a report, but a confession in disguise. She wrote about the soil, the seeds, the water that shimmered in the Oklahoma sun. She wrote about learning new words and how "thank you" had become the hardest one to say. And, between the lines, invisible but alive, she wrote about the cowboy, the man whose silence spoke louder than sermons, whose kindness had cracked something open in her heart that no nation, no war could close again. When she finished, she folded the letter neatly, knowing it would never be sent. Some truths, she realized, belonged only to the present moment, to the space between giver and receiver, to the silence after an apple changes hands. Viewers, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe by pressing the button just below this video screen, then click the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Every time you support us this way, it helps us keep bringing forgotten human stories like this one to light. Months passed. The sun burned hotter, then softened. The fields changed. The seeds Anna had planted grew, flowered, faded. Her body grew stronger, her cheeks fuller, her skin no longer pale, but touched with the color of Oklahoma's sun. The garden bloomed, the language lessons continued, and her hands no longer shook when she wrote. But then came the orders. Her name was called during morning roll. She was being sent home. Repatriation. The word felt like fiction. Her home, she knew, no longer existed. They gave her a small satchel, one change of clothing, a comb, a pair of socks, and tucked quietly inside, the cowboy's pencil, sharpened again, neatly, its tip curved to a soft point. She didn't see him the day she left. She looked for him along the fences, near the sheds, even in the garden, but there was only dust, wind, and the faint imprint of where his boots had once stood. The train back to Germany moved slower than the one that had brought her. The windows weren't boarded this time. She saw the world again, towns, trees, fields, but the closer they came to Leipzig, the tighter her chest became. She stepped off the final platform into silence. Not the silence of Oklahoma, not the silence of peace, but the silence of death. Her city was ash and echo. Where once had stood markets, schools, families, there was nothing but rubble and the sound of shoes crunching broken glass. Her mother's street was gone, her childhood apartment, a blackened hole. She stood in the middle of it, dust clinging to her coat, and realized that the war had never really ended here. It had just collapsed in on itself. People looked at her with hollow eyes. A neighbor barely recognized her. Another turned away, muttering something about survivors. Whispers followed her into every street, about the prisoners who had been treated too well, who came back heavier than they'd left. At a makeshift ration line, an old man stared at her arms, at the color in her cheeks, and spat at the ground. "Must have been a soft camp," he said. She said nothing. What could she say? That she had eaten bacon while others starved? That she had laughed, even once, at a guard's joke? That a black man had given her an apple with more gentleness than any German officer had ever shown her? No one wanted that truth. She tried once to mention it. Just once. Around a fire, someone asked what the Americans were like. She said, "Not cruel." The others went quiet. One woman looked at her as if she had confessed a crime. Another said coldly, "They fed you because they wanted something." Anna didn't reply. She touched the pencil in her pocket, the one thing she had brought back, and turned away. At night, she wrote again, not to anyone, just to remember. She wrote about the sun in Oklahoma, about the seeds, about the quiet. She wrote the cowboy's name, though she had never known it, and sketched the curve of his hat from memory. She wrote because it was the only way to carry him with her. He had become more than a man. He had become a question. What if kindness could survive war? What if compassion, quiet, uncelebrated, was stronger than ideology? What if the enemy had saved her, not with medicine or orders, but with a fruit placed gently into her hand? In the years to come, she would never speak his name aloud, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew that no one would believe it. A pencil, a piece of fruit, a man who didn't raise his voice. These were not the trophies of war. They were too small, too human. And yet, they were the only things worth carrying home. Years passed. The world changed its shape again and again, shifting like sand beneath Anna's feet. Wars ended, governments fell, borders redrew themselves, and new names replaced old ones in newspapers. But some things never changed. Not really. In a small village outside Dresden, Anna built a quiet life among others who didn't ask too many questions. She worked as a school teacher, kept her garden neat, and wore her grief like a well-folded scarf, tucked in, but always there. Her hair turned silver slowly without her noticing. Her hands, once blistered from digging Oklahoma soil, became softer again, but not without memory. Sometimes in the early mornings when the fog still clung to the grass, she would press her fingers into the earth and feel for something deeper than roots, something older than war. In the back corner of her garden, just beyond the fence, she planted apple trees. No one asked why, no one needed to. It was her ritual. Every spring she waited for them to bloom. Some years they did, some years they didn't. But always she watched. The apple had become more than a memory. It was a symbol now, as heavy as a monument. She remembered the way it had tasted in her mouth, sweet, tart, impossibly crisp. But it wasn't just the fruit, it was the moment, the weight of it in her hand, the way it had been offered, palm out, without words, without power, without threat. That moment had split her world in two, before and after. Before the apple, she had been a prisoner of fear. After it, she became something else, someone capable of questioning. She never found the cowboy again. She hadn't expected to. Some stories don't ask to be continued. They ask to be remembered. His face aged in her memory, always quiet, always steady. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw him standing by the garden's edge, arms crossed, hat tipped against the sun, watching seeds take root. She imagined he had returned to Texas, or perhaps drifted further west, back into that vast landscape he seemed born from. She hoped he had lived a long life. She hoped someone had handed him something kind once. As the years folded into decades, Anna's students came and went, never knowing what their teacher carried in the quiet spaces between lessons. She never told them about the camp, never described the bacon or the garden, or the letters she never sent. But every now and then, when she passed around slices of apple during autumn festivals, she would pause, just for a second, and in that second, the taste would return, not just to her mouth, but to her chest, her eyes, her breath. It was never about the apple. It was about what it represented. A moment when the enemy became human, a gesture that asked nothing but offered everything. In a world built on slogans and flags, it had been a single act of unspoken truth, that she mattered, that dignity could survive fire. In the final spring of her life, her apple trees bloomed brighter than ever. She walked among them slowly, fingers brushing each branch, petals catching in her hair. She picked one fruit, polished it against her sleeve, and took a bite. The flavor was sharp, cold, and vivid. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back in Oklahoma, back behind barbed wire, back beneath a sky too big for hatred, and standing just a few steps away. A man in a cowboy hat watched her, not with pity, not with pride, but with the quiet grace of someone who once offered a gift and asked for nothing in return. And even now, she thought, as the world spun and history rearranged itself, that taste had never left her,